Hi everyone, Bethany here. We've got a live show coming up that you should know about. Science for the People will be at the American Association for the Advancement of Science meeting, or AAAS to its friends. We, and by that I mean me, Bethany, are heading to their live podcasting stage. Come out at the AAAS meeting in Washington, D.C. on Friday, February 15th at 1:30 p.m. to hear about plastic. Plastic everywhere. Where is it going and what do we do about it? And if you come out to the show, you will get the chance to be the people who ask the questions. Get your questions ready and get ready to show me up. Hope to see you there. Now, onward to the podcast.
Welcome to Science for the People. I'm Rochelle Saunders. Today we're talking about maps and all the things we can do and often have already done with maps. With me are the authors of All Over the Map, a simply marvelous new coffee table book from National Geographic. I have with me Betsy Mason, a science journalist based in the San Francisco Bay Area. She has previously been the online science editor for Wired, where she built an award-winning science section and was the science reporter for the Contra Costa Times. She was a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT for the 2015-2016 academic year, and she also has a master's degree in geology from Stanford. Betsy, welcome to Science for the People.
Thanks for having me.
And also with me is Greg Miller, a science and technology journalist based in Portland, Oregon. Previously, he was a senior writer at Wired and a staff writer at Science Magazine, where he won several honors and awards for his work. Greg also writes about neuroscience and other areas of biological and behavioral science. He earned a PhD in neuroscience at Stanford before becoming a journalist. Greg, welcome to you too.
Hi, glad to be here.
Let's talk about maps. So I want to hear from each of you. Maybe, Betsy, we'll start with you about how you got interested in mapping specifically.
Well, I don't do a lot of actual mapping myself, although I have tried, and it's a lot more difficult than you might guess. But I did make maps in college and graduate school when I was studying geology. And I think that learning how to make geologic maps was probably part of what really got me into maps. It's when I first realized that maps can do so much more than just help you find your way or locate things in space. And I've just grown more and more fascinated with maps the more Greg and I have learned about them as we've been writing about them for the past 5 or 6 years.
I think my earliest memories go back to being a little kid in the back of the car on family vacations, just rummaging around through all the maps my parents had stashed back there. I think the maps really kind of piqued my curiosity about the world and what all was out there waiting to be explored. And I still, all this time later, I think there's something just really visually compelling about maps, at least for me, that makes me want to know what's going on there, what's the story behind the map.
I was interested to see what your science background was, because I saw that Betsy has a background in geology, which for a lot of people has sort of mental connections that they can immediately make with mapping. Mm-hmm. But if you look at your science background in neuroscience, perhaps not quite so obvious connections between neuroscience and mapping.
Yeah, but not totally unrelated. My PhD had to do with how the brain represents spatial information, how the brain converts the things we see and hear into a map of the space around us and helps us navigate that space.
There is something about mapping that draws a lot of people in. It's not unusual to see people spending a lot of time looking at all different types of maps. I remember as a kid, I spent a lot of time looking at globes and atlases, and I regularly, if there's an atlas around or a globe around, you see kids playing with it and looking at it. So what is it about maps that draws us in?
Well, I do think that there's something just visually appealing that just grabs people's attention oftentimes, and that may have something to do with the brain's particular relationship with maps or, with sort of space in general. But once you start looking at a map, if you're actually looking at it, there is almost always more to see than you first see when you glance at it. And so I think that that's probably part of why people spend a lot of time looking at maps. There's layers of information in almost any map.
It's one of the things that definitely I find looking at maps in general, and one of the things I found about this book in particular and a lot of the maps in here was I could spend so much time just pouring through the details, and there are so many details and so many different layers of information built into a lot of these maps. And I find it really fascinating how much you can how much information you can transmit to another mind just in this visual form. Maps can be so dense.
Yeah, I think that's true because they're visual and in a way that's very intuitive for people to understand. I think they're a really effective way of communicating a lot of information. They're very efficient means of communicating on all kinds of levels about the spatial relationship between things. There's always more than initially meets the eye in a map.
I think a good illustration of that, Greg, is your story on the Soviet military maps, how they sort of described it as a precursor to a internet web page about a given place.
Yeah, these were maps that were made during the Cold War by the Soviet military, and they're just incredibly detailed maps of American cities, European cities. They map the entire world at 7 different scales, but the city maps are just insanely detailed down to the footprints of buildings and things like that. And they pack on all these additional details like the load-bearing capacity of our bridges and what they were made of and how high above the water they were, and which sort of raises the question of how they got that information. But yeah, the idea that Alex Kent, a geographer in the UK who's done a lot of research on these, thinks of them as a sort of pre-internet database where the Soviet military put everything that they had learned about the outside world on the maps in the days before computers.
I definitely think the Russian Cold War maps in particular are really good examples of something that a lot of really good maps do, which is allow you to both sort of zoom out and get an overview look at an entire space or an entire set of ideas. In this case, entire cities. You can kind of look at the whole shape of something, but you can also drill down to a small portion, like you do often in the book, where you kind of call out a large section of the map and then give us a close-up view of a smaller piece of it, so we can see how detailed some of these maps get as you drill into them. And that definitely seems to be a feature of some very good, very interesting maps, is that you can use them at kind of any zoom level.
Yeah, that's if you ask cartographers what makes a good map, of course there's some disagreement, but one of the things that comes up most often is visual hierarchy, that you should be able to, at first glance, get a sort of overview, and then the longer you look, reveal new layers of information. And the Soviet maps certainly do that. They're really well-made maps.
I also want to talk a little bit about the idea of maps and diagrams, and also a little bit about infographics. Some of the maps that you've included in this book, to some people, might read less as maps and more as diagrams, or potentially even infographics. So is there a line to be drawn there, or are the definitions a bit fluid?
There's probably a line, but we didn't draw it.
We've taken a very broad view of what is a map. Anything that could probably qualify in someone's mind as a map, we if we like it, we'll include it. But I think, something that's intention is a spatial representation of things, even if that's not exactly geographical, could qualify as a map. So we definitely have things that I think people might think of as diagrams, like maps of the neurons in the hippocampus, or some different maps of the flow of goods around the world and things like that. But in my mind, they're definitely all maps, and we would count architectural blueprints as maps. In fact, we do have the sort of blueprints of the Death Star in the book.
I love that one. I like that you guys incorporated not just sort of factual maps about the real world, but also some really fascinating mapping work of imaginary spaces. You called out the Death Star, but also there is a fascinating map by Jerry Gretzinger. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name correctly. I absolutely love that section. Can you talk a little bit about that map? Because that was very cool.
Yeah, I wrote that one, and Jerry's map is definitely one of my favorites. It's been a favorite for a long time. And I think one of the things that just keeps me interested in his map is trying to understand why he does it. He's been working on this map of an imaginary world that's just in his mind for 35 years now, and that's over the course of 55 years. So he's been doing this since he was a college student, and he works on it every day. And not only is he continuing to add to the map in physical space, he's also editing the existing map. So right now, this map is made out of 8 by 10 pieces of paper, and there are over 3,500 pieces, and the map is more than 55 feet across at this point. And it keeps growing, but it's also constantly changing. So there's 7 or 8, I think he might even be on the 9th generation of some of these panels of the map. And so you can watch the map as it became sort of less map-like and more abstract. And he started incorporating all sorts of other things into the map. Like it started out with sort of city grids and things you could recognize as town centers and rural areas and even mountain areas and rivers and all that. And now there are bits of his journal, there's parts of letters, there's pieces of magazines, and lots of different colors that don't look natural. There's areas that have turned from green to purple. And he continues to do this every single day. It's amazing. And he's developed this crazy system to guide him in how to change the map. And it's based on a deck of cards, and it's sort of based on chance, but he, of course, has designed the deck of cards and changes it when he doesn't like what's happening to the map. But the cards will tell him to, say, add an airport to an area, or add new paint colors, or to add a new panel to the outskirts of the map, or to add a void, which is sort of one of the strangest instructions on the cards, but that just means a blank white spot appears on a panel, and that void can grow. It can swallow entire towns, but you can also build defense walls against the void if the cards bring that up in time, and maybe save a town from being swallowed.
I had never heard about this map before, or this project, and I just love this so much. It's such an interesting game to have developed to kind of play with yourself and play with the idea of space and mapping and art. I'm just so in love with this little project, this big project, this enormous project.
Yeah, I think Jerry would actually really like that description of how you put it, what he's doing, that he's playing a game with space and art. He spends a lot of time thinking about whether or not his map is art. I think it definitely is, but some people might disagree, I guess. It's really hard to talk about this map without showing it, because it's just incredible looking, because it definitely looks like a map, but then it also looks kind of crazy, and it's just, swirls of color and tons of tiny details. I actually have a couple of copies of some of the panels from his map on my wall.
Oh, it's amazing. And where we're able to, we'll link to some pictures so some of the listeners can look at some of the images that are available as we're talking. Because obviously, as we've said, mapping is a highly visual experience, and we want to provide as much of that as we can given the medium. I want to talk a little bit more as well about the idea of maps and art, because this is something that is constantly coming up when you look at maps, when you talk about maps, in the way maps are viewed by the world and by people, and also quite often in the ways maps were originally designed in some cases. There is a very gray spectrum between a map as an idea of just like a way to portray facts or the way to create spatial representations, and the idea of map as art, which is sort of core to the idea of map making, because even when we close our eyes and think of what is a map and we think back to the history of where maps first came up, art has always been kind of baked into the base idea of what a map is.
I think a really interesting example of that in the book is there's a section on the earliest maps of the moon that were made shortly after the invention of the telescope. A lot of those maps were, they're images that a lot of people might look at and not consider a map because they look like just a beautiful sketch or drawing of the moon by Galileo and other people who were among the earliest users of telescopes. Some of them were artists themselves, but a lot of them were kind of collaborations between the more scientific-minded people who were inventing and building and using telescopes and actual artists who could help them capture what they were seeing for the first time. Now, the detail in the surface of the moon. And then those quickly became maps as people started putting names on the craters and various features, and not long after that, squabbling about which saints and noble people they should be named after. But that's an area where the very first maps really came out of a collaboration between artists and scientists.
I think cartography, sort of in its essence, is a collaboration between art and science. And the best maps excel at both, in my mind. And one example from the book is a map of the Grand Canyon that was made in the 1970s by a man named Bradford Washburn, who is a famous mountaineer and explorer. And he spent 8 years making this map of the Grand Canyon, partnered with National Geographic. And he was so careful about every detail of, he actually measured the canyon again, did all the surveying over again, measured every bit of trail, and used the newest lasers to measure distances between points, and had himself dropped onto little spires in the canyon by helicopters. And then he also spent years hiring the best cartographic artists in Switzerland and one of National Geographic's great Swiss-trained cartographers, and just sweated every detail about how much blue should be in the shadows, exactly how they would draw the cliff faces, what color the contour lines should be. And his goal was to make it look like the Grand Canyon, but also just be a beautiful cartographic masterpiece. And I think it's just a really nice combination of extremely accurate and extremely beautiful.
It is an absolutely gorgeous map. And like many kind of overview, bird's eye view maps we create, it's difficult to place it on the spectrum from map to landscape art. This was one of the ones that stand out, but there were several maps that you profiled in the book that when you look at them, they wouldn't look out of place, just massive on a wall as a piece of art. The fact that they are very detailed representations of actual landscape is not secondary, but those two things, you sort of have to capture them and hold them in your mind at once. And the way that artists use to try and show you a vast landscape that is actually quite difficult to represent accurately in 2 dimensions is quite fascinating to read about.
Yeah, I think there's 2 really good examples of that are sort of look like more like landscape paintings, and they're sort of related. One is by an Austrian, I guess people called him a panoramist, cartographic panoramist named Heinrich Baron, and the piece of his that we have is of Yellowstone National Park, and it's just beautiful. But what's interesting about it is that it's actually more beautiful than any view of Yellowstone that is actually possible. And part of that is because he uses sort of a non-existent oblique view of the park, for one. And he also is quite accurate about things in the park and how they look and the colors and all those sorts of things, but he also exaggerates some things and contorts some things and tweaks things about the landscape to bring out the best of the park in this one view. So, for example, the view is looking south, and at the south end of Yellowstone is Teton National Park. And so if you were looking from this view that he has, though, you'd be looking end on the Teton Range. And so it would just be one little sort of blob and totally unrecognizable. So he just rotated the Tetons about 55 degrees so you could see their iconic face in this view. He also made the geysers bigger than they actually are. And I think also the Old Faithful Lodge is about 3/4 of a mile long in his painting. But the end result is such a true representation of Yellowstone, and yet a more beautiful representation than you could get if you were looking at it from a plane in a similar view.
I love this idea of accuracy in maps. We assume that what we see in a map quite often is fact, that is the space as it stands. In particular, with maps that are all about the space that you can see or the space that's around you. But quite often, if not always, you have to do some kind of distortion in a map because you're taking a 3D space and making it kind of fit a 2D environment. One of my favorite examples that you call out in some detail in the book is the idea of building ski maps. So on various ski hills, how they go about creating the maps of where the trails and the chairlifts and all those kinds of things are. I found that section really interesting.
Yeah, that's actually the second example that I was thinking of. And this man, Jim Nehughes, has painted virtually, well, at least the majority of ski resorts in North America. But he's actually quite inspired by Heinrich Buran, but he's also making a map that people are going to actually use to navigate by. So he had the challenge of getting everything that's important, every face of the different slopes, which might be at completely different angles, and somehow showing them in one view, but keeping everything relatively true and all the different heights and lengths of trails and directions of trails, so that, you know, all the lift lines appear to go up and all the trails appear to go down. So it was really challenging for him to make sure that the map was intuitive, but also capture everything. Like some resorts have got, you know, slopes that you can ski down on two opposite sides of a mountain. How do you show that on one map? So he does sort of distort things in a way, but also has to keep them so true to life such that if the skier is using it, they won't notice.
Yeah, they need to be distorted so you can see everything in a space where no such map exists, but also realistic and factual enough that if you're in the middle of the space, you can literally use it to guide you around the space.
Yeah, if you've skied in North America, chances are you have used one of his maps. And on top of that all, they're beautiful. They're just beautiful. They're, you know, work of art paintings.
This idea reminds me of another kind of well-known map that is not at all true to life when you sort of put it on top of an actual representation of the space, which is something like the London Underground map. That iconic image that you get of the stations and where they are and the different lines that connect them and their sort of logic around where they're connected. If you actually look at the underground system and those stations as they exist with streets and roads, it doesn't look at all like the map, but somehow the map of those stations still gives you everything you need to know while not necessarily being true to the factual spatial representation if on street level.
Yeah, the transit maps are a great example of cartographers prioritizing how people are actually going to use the map over actual geography. If you're trying to get around London, you just need to know which line to get on and where to get off. You don't necessarily need to know every curve and twist that the track takes.
There are so many parts of life that kind of get built up around maps as well. Keeping with London, I was delighted to find you profiled the Geographer's A to Z map of London. Could you talk a little bit about that map and some of the information that's grown up around it? It's such a lovely map.
Yeah, the A to Z guides, as they say there. I lived in London for a short time for an internship when I was just getting started as a science journalist, and I totally relied on my A to Z. I still have it tattered, torn, and coffee stained on my desk. They're just incredible. London is such an organic city. There's no grid. It's just this medieval street pattern of streets that is bewildering to a newcomer. It's a big city and a dense city, and the streets change names after a block, and there are all these tiny little hidden alleyways, and it's really hard to find your way around. And this was kind of in the days before GPS, so there really was no better way than an A to Z guide to finding your way around London. I've always loved how those maps just pack so much information into a small space, but they're still remarkably legible and readable and usable. So I think there's a real genius to that.
That map somehow manages to be both momentarily overwhelming and incredibly clear at the same time, which is not an easy feat.
Yeah, that's right.
I'd also love for you to talk a little bit about the map that spread a little bit of misunderstanding quite by accident, which talked about the canals of Mars. I had read about this a while back, and I was delighted to also see this particular map and series of maps profiled in your book. Yeah,
that's one of the more interesting stories of maps leading us astray. But early on, as people were starting to draw sketches of the moon, they were also, just catching their first glimpses of Mars. And as telescopes got better, the pictures that people were drawing of the planet got better. And at some point, astronomers started to see these sort of dark lines and light areas through the telescope, and they started drawing those as continents and water, which is obvious thing to do since that's sort of what our planet looks like. And soon, one particular astronomer named Giovanni Schiaparelli started making those dark lines straighter and straighter. And this is what he was seeing in the telescope. And there's still some sort of disagreement about what he was actually looking at. But as those lines became straighter and straighter, it became really difficult for people to accept that they might just be natural. And so the obvious conclusion was that they were somehow artificial. And people started to speculate that they were made by Martians. And Schiaparelli was skeptical of this. He didn't think that was necessary. He thought there were enough sort of natural canals and straightish lines on Earth that you didn't need the artificial explanation. But he was Italian, and he called those lines canali. I guess that's how you'd pronounce it in Italian. But in Italian, this means channels, which can imply either artificial or natural. And from the things that he said about them, it seems that he was really meaning the natural channels, but it was translated as canals. And that one translation really spurred the idea that they were artificial. And one American astronomer in particular, Percival Lowell, grabbed onto that idea and just ran with it. He even built an entire observatory in Arizona to look at Mars and draw his own maps, and toured around the country talking about the life on Mars, even once this idea had been pretty much debunked by scientists for various reasons. The public still loved it, and as we know, it inspired all sorts of science fiction like War of the Worlds.
Definitely an iconic piece of science fiction that I heard had been inspired by this particular piece of kind of misunderstanding that started as a map, which I love, and I think that also speaks to how much we tend to trust maps because we see them as holders of factual information.
Oh yeah, if you put something on a map, people are much more likely to believe it. There's a strong tendency to believe that maps are always an attempt to convey reality, and that's just not the case.
You cover a couple of these in the book where you talk in depth about some of the ways that we try and either actively or just through incorrect beliefs or agendas, political agendas, how we drive inaccuracy or how we drive maybe not entirely factual information using maps.
Yeah, there are a bunch of examples in the book about how maps have been used to advance a particular agenda. We have a couple propaganda maps. We have at least one really beautiful advertising map. But I think one of the more interesting and actually insidious examples of this is a map of San Francisco's Chinatown that was produced in 1885 by the city's Board of Supervisors at a time when anti-immigrant fervor was sweeping the country. And in San Francisco, a lot of it was directed at Chinese immigrants who'd come in the preceding decades to work on the Transcontinental Railroad. And then once the railroad was finished, they started settling down in the thousands in the Chinatown, what was then and still is San Francisco's Chinatown. And because they were willing to work for low pay and do hard jobs, resentment began to build that they were stealing jobs from quote real Americans. And so the city passed a series of really discriminatory laws, and the U.S. Congress in 1882 passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which essentially we'd call now a travel ban. It forbid the immigration of Chinese laborers. But the fact remained that the thousands of people were still there in Chinatown, and the city supervisors wanted an excuse to kick them out. So they commissioned this study, a report, and a map that documented supposedly all the disease and moral depravity that was going on in Chinatown, to make the argument that this was a public health hazard to the city and needed to be cleared out. So the map kind of purports to show all of the gambling houses and opium dens and Chinese run brothels in the city. The report cites this dubious doctor, claiming that nearly all cases of venereal disease in the entire city originate in Chinatown. And you can see on the map all these green blocks of buildings where there's prostitution supposedly in that part of town. But I think that map is a really good example of how maps are tools, and like any tools, they can be used for good or bad, depending on who's making them and what their agenda is. And I think Betsy's right. Like, you see something on a map, you tend to believe it. Like, oh, of course there must be, that must be a brothel because it says so on the map.
Maps also, especially historical maps, are such great little windows into the past, the pieces of information, pressing problems of the day, opinions of the day, like with the map you just called out about San Francisco's Chinatown. One of the sections that I spent a lot of time kind of like with it close to my nose looking at all the details was Hitomi Terasawa's map of Hong Kong's I think it's Kowloon Walled City. What a gorgeous set of maps and diagrams there with so much information.
Yeah, that's a really incredible map. I think we're fortunate. I think that's our book is the first time that's been published outside of Japan. But Kowloon Walled City was a really fascinating place. It was the densest human settlement that's ever existed. It started as a squatters colony inside Hong Kong, inside an old British fort in Hong Kong in the early 1900s, and grew over the years into this 7-acre dense complex of mid-rise buildings, like 13-story buildings that the residents built themselves. So totally not up to any kind of code and really put together piecemeal. And so there was the walled city had its own schools and temples, its own economy. There was just all kinds of stuff going on. Some of it legitimate, some of it more unsavory types of commerce. And so before the city decided in the 90s to tear this place down, and because it was just unsafe and there was a lot of crime. But before they did, this group of Japanese architects took it upon themselves to go there and document it for posterity. They convinced the city to let them in for about a week. They took survey equipment and cameras, and they just spent a week basically exploring the compound, sort of during the time when all the residents, all the thousands of people who lived there had been moved out, and the construction crews were getting ready to tear the place down. This little expedition team, as they called themselves, went in and documented as much as they could. And then this woman, Hitomi Terasawa, is an illustrator, made just this spectacular map of it's a really long cross section through the walled city. And she, in every little room in that, it's a really dense map, but every room tells a story. She tried to recreate what life was like in each room based on the remnants, the things that people had left behind. And so you can see just all kinds of things. There are little mom and pop factories. There are all these cut rate doctors and dentists who set up shop in the walled city because they didn't have a license to practice in Hong Kong proper. There are like strip shows. There are people shooting up drugs. There's just, and they're, innocent things, people hanging their laundry and children playing on the roof. So it's just such a rich tableau that kind of brings to life this crazy place that existed for, a short time in human history and, will never exist again.
It definitely.
Greg had to work pretty hard to get access to that map to publish it in the book, so we're pretty excited to have it.
It's beautiful, and it definitely is one of these ones where you can spend so much time poring over the details. It is very evocative, and it gives you a little bit of insight into what life in this place would have been like. It manages to be kind of claustrophobic on purpose, to give you the feeling of how much was kind of crammed up next to each other in this space, and how these single spaces were used for so many different types of things right next door to each other. It's absolutely fascinating to spend time poring over. Very cool. I do want to talk a little bit about the way we create some of these maps, in particular, the way we create maps when we can't necessarily see all of the things for ourselves. Obviously, when you're looking at trying to create a map of somewhere like the Grand Canyon, you go there, you take lots of pictures, you fly over it, you get satellite imagery. But there's some really interesting mapping in here that's been done through kind of using other types of data. One of the ones in particular was Marie Tharp's underwater map, which was so huge and important scientifically, but is also quite a feat in being able to map something you can't see.
Yeah, and the fact that you really can't see the bottom of the ocean is part of why it remains very poorly mapped. And I would argue that Marie Tharp's ocean floor maps are, potentially still the best maps of that space if what you're looking for is a real sense of what the ocean floor is like. And, like any good geologist, she had to do this by piecing together very few pieces of information that were sort of scattered about and interpreting what went on between those points. And so she did this in, I guess they started in the 1940s and 50s by using the lines of echo sounding that ships did as they crossed across the Atlantic to begin with. So these are sort of depth measurements that were done using sound, measuring how long it would take for the sound to bounce off the ocean floor and return to the ship, and deciding, sort of translating that into a depth. And so she would take these lines and sketch out what the ocean floor looked like at exactly that line. And she had, she would have maybe a dozen of these for the entire Atlantic Ocean. And so what do you do in between? So she started trying to draw exactly what the ocean floor looked like right along these ship tracks. And she used a method called a physiographic diagram, which is basically a sort of little three-dimensional representational sketch of landforms. So she had lots of little mountains and valleys and plains drawn along these lines. And she started to notice that in the center of the ocean, there was a ridge, a rise, and we already sort of understood that there was a high point running down the center of the ocean. But she saw that there was within the high point a cleft, a sort of deep valley at the very top of that high point. And she thought that this might be evidence of what at the time was a controversial theory called continental drift. And U.S. scientists were very opposed to this idea because they thought that nobody had come up with a reason for why and how continents would actually move across the face of the Earth. There was a lot of reason to believe that they had, but no reason to understand how they had. And for that reason, U.S. scientists were basically rejecting the theory. But she thought that this cleft in the top of the mid-ocean rise might be where plates were pulling apart and new crust was being formed. And so she started to map out the cleft and found it everywhere she looked. And while she was doing this work, another scientist had a sort of an intern or a young guy drafting out the locations of earthquakes along on the ocean floor. This was work for Bell Labs to help them understand where would be the safest place to put their transatlantic cables to avoid getting broken by underwater landslides, which had happened a few times in the past. And so as he was mapping out these earthquake epicenters, they noticed that the cleft and the epicenters lined up exactly. And so this, she understood, was going to be a way for her to map out where the cleft was in between the cross sections that she had of the ocean. So she used that and her general understanding of what the different types of features you could have on the ocean floor were to sketch the entire ocean floor in a way that evokes how the terrain actually looks. So it's not a contour map. You don't have to interpret it. It's a drawing sort of at an oblique angle, like if you were flying over the ocean floor, what it would actually look like. And this was the first time anybody had done this. And so it was sort of the first time that people had gotten a glimpse of what the ocean floor actually looks like.
And did this help sort of move the argument? Obviously, currently we see continental drift as a thing that is, but at the time it would have been highly controversial. So did this contribute to making continental drift a more accepted theory?
Yeah, it definitely did. There's a moment where scientists are gathered to discuss this idea, and the map is shown to all these scientists, and it makes a really big impression because here is sort of physical evidence of a sort of, proof that there's a potential mechanism, that here's where it might actually be happening. And this happened in conjunction with a film that Jacques Cousteau showed at the same meeting, because he had seen the map and thought, well, this will be easy to prove that this is not true. I'll just drag this new underwater camera that I've made across the mid-ocean ridge and show that there's nothing there. And of course, when he did that, he found that it was there. And so he showed this, and scientists believed it. Obviously, they were seeing it with their own ideas. So even if they hadn't exactly trusted Marie's map, once Jacques Cousteau showed them that in at least one place this thing did actually exist, they started to believe it. And a lot of scientists today say that was a big moment that helped turn the tide toward U.S. scientists believing in plate tectonics.
There's another great representation of water in the book. It was the one that, because it's early on in the book, I seem to recall, it's the waterways map of the U.S. that's, I believe, driven off of data collected from NASA's space shuttle program. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is a map that is based on elevation data that came largely from the space shuttle program. And basically what they did was they took all these elevations and applied an algorithm to them that could understand by the geometry where rivers were located on the surface. And so mapped them all out. And the map that we have is basically just those lines of river. And what's interesting is that because the rivers are all, related to the topography of the landscape, you can actually see the topography of the landscape just by having those rivers there. So you can see the Rocky Mountains, you can see the Sierra Nevada, you can see all the flatter areas. So it's really actually a really beautiful picture, even though it's just a black and white line drawing.
I also like how there are some of these maps that manage to capture not only a place and a snapshot of time, but also ongoing change through time. There's a great map on the Mississippi River that outlines the way that river has changed over time in this sort of overlapping way of using different colors to represent different time periods of the Mississippi River. And that's a really fascinating map that, again, initially when you look at it, you think, what is this even showing me? And then as you start to kind of pull it apart and look at each individual piece and how those different outlines of the river compare to previous ones, it gives you a really great little story of what has changed over time around that space.
Yeah, these are some of my absolute favorite maps. It's funny because these were made in the 1940s, but cartographers discovered them maybe a couple decades ago. And they have become sort of part of the cartography canon and hailed as some of the most effective and beautiful maps that have been made. And what's really cool about them is that they show something about this river that everybody knows, the Mississippi River, that people don't really understand about it. And that is that it moves all the time. This river wants to swerve from side to side across the plain that it cuts through, 50 miles across side to side. And it has, over the past 6,000 years, moved quite a bit and built new channels and abandoned old channels. And so this obviously has implications for people who live right next to the river, because if it's moving, your house could just get eaten by the river if it changed channels and went that way. And this is part of why the Mississippi River floods all the time. And so the Army Corps of Engineers were looking for ways to control the river for decades. And in the 1940s, they asked this geologist, Harold Fisk, to help them understand the past history of the Mississippi River so they could sort of get a handle on its future. And he went around and took bores into the old river channels and looked at the sediments and used aerial photographs and put together this picture of everywhere that the Mississippi River had been over the past 6,000 years, and colored each channel that it had used a different color. And so the end result is this sort of crazy, loopy, colorful spaghetti picture that is just so much looks like abstract art, and yet also has this really organic feeling to it. And it just conveys so well the restless nature of that river in such concrete, easy to see terms. It's really interesting that this was a very practical project, and these maps were buried in a government report for decades before the Army Corps of Engineers digitized them, because they had only made about 1,000 copies of this report with these really expensive full color maps in it. And they would get requests from scientists all the time. So finally they digitized them, put them online, and then they were discovered by cartographers at some point, and they've sort of become this iconic part of cartographic history.
Another way we often portray change in a static image on a map is being able to portray information about certain battles during wars or during attacks. There's a couple of really interesting maps in the book that cover various pieces of information that very clearly portray the movements or the ebbs and the flows of certain attacks or ebbs and flows of certain battles. I'm thinking in particular of the Gettysburg map, which is, again, a beautiful map, but also as you drill into it, there's so much information there.
Yeah, it's another one that's just, could easily be mistaken as a landscape painting, because it is quite a beautiful landscape painting. And again, it's sort of an oblique bird's eye view looking down at the Gettysburg battlefield. But like you said, the man who made it, John Badger Batchelder, put on the map the location of every regiment of both the Confederate and Union armies for each of the 3 days of the battle by interviewing everybody who was still alive, who had been in that battle, and asking them to confirm where they were on the map and sort of piecing together this picture of what happened in Gettysburg. So yeah, there's all these incredible details in there. And that map actually helped us to sort of understand Gettysburg the way we do as a critical turning point in the war, and sort of gave us this story of how the battle unfolded, which may or may not be exactly how it happened, but he was doing all these interviews immediately after the battle occurred. So it's as close as we'll ever get to what actually happened.
So there's obviously so many amazing maps in the book, but I'm actually curious to hear what maps maybe didn't make the cut, because obviously a book has a finite size and cannot contain all possible amazing maps. So I'm curious to hear from each of you if there's a map that didn't quite make the cut, but that you wish had, or that you'd like to call out as something that people might want to investigate on their own.
Oh, that's really hard. I think every time I come across a great map, I wish we'd been able to fit it in the book. I don't know. There's so much great cartography being done even now that with all the data that's available for people to work with, and the digital tools that cartographers have, it's almost every week somebody has done something clever and often beautiful. So I don't know if I have a particular example off the top of my head. Maybe Betsy does.
Well, I can say a couple things. We definitely had a number of discussions about how many geologic maps was appropriate to have in the book, because as a geologist, I'm sort of somewhat partial to geologic maps. But there is one map in particular that I wish we had been able to put in, but it's another map of the Grand Canyon. And we were trying really hard to have a broad range of geography and time periods, and we were trying to have different kinds of map makers. And this was a map, from North America from the 19th century. So it was similar to too many other maps that we had. But this was one of the very first maps that was made of the Grand Canyon when they were first doing the Western surveys. And I think it's really beautiful, but I haven't quite found the story behind it yet. And so we didn't put it in.
Any sort of modern map makers or cartographers that you advise people who are interested in map making kind of keep their eyes on?
That's kind of fraught, because if we mention names, we'll be invariably forgetting other names, and there's so many great people. But I would say for people who are interested in learning more about the current state of cartography, to check out NACIS, which is the North American Cartographic Information Society. They have an annual meeting every year where people get together, working cartographers who work for government agencies and places like the New York Times and Washington Post, places like Apple, companies. It's a really interesting and diverse group of people who are at the cutting edge and the forefront of cartography. And they also publish an atlas every 2 years called the Atlas of Design, where they feature some of the work that it's sort of, they themselves feel is the most creative and best work in their field today. And that's always a really beautiful book filled with great maps that have of all different types that have been made just in the last year or two.
Yeah, I would agree that places like the New York Times are really doing amazing, innovative maps that are really going to the next step of helping people understand different issues that are going on with maps that are both static for the print version and interactive and are just really, really interesting and thinking of new ways to make electoral maps and things like that. And I'd also say that National Geographic continues to make really, really interesting editorial maps for the magazine that, that they have both on the pages and then as the sometimes poster-sized supplements of different things like bird migrations. And those are always really beautiful and informative at the same time.
One of the things that no physical book can capture, but that the internet does really well, is allow us to provide new ways of interacting with maps and providing ways that maps can shift and change kind of with our control to show us things. A common one that I'm sure many listeners would have seen is before-after mapping of spaces. So you get satellite images of spaces before some kind of disaster or tragedy hits, and then after, and you end up with this sort of slider that lets you move back and forth to really sort of viscerally see the impacts of physical spaces before and after major events. And that's something that is much easier to see sometimes in an online space, or maps that kind of slowly transition from one state to another, or where you can sort of see the physical change of something actually changing on the screen, which is, I'm assuming, kind of there's a bunch of innovations in map making that come just from being able to interact with a map.
Yeah, and I think the Times is a particularly good example where they've, one of the first things that people do when you give them a map is try to find themselves on the map, find their own town or whatever. And the Times has done a bunch of interactive maps in the last few years that allow you to type in your zip code and learn something about, I forget what the one was. It was something about education and where people end up in life and how that's rooted in geography. And so you can kind of type in your own information or the towns where you've lived and see the data, pull up the data for that area. So I think things like that are really interesting too, and allowing people to not only interact but interact in a more personalized way.
It's interesting to me as well. I remember when Pokemon Go first came out, I was playing it in where I lived at the time, and I hadn't lived there for very long, only about a year and a half. And what I found quite interesting was this game I was playing, it forced me to kind of go and see new and actually kind of interesting places in my local area. So it provided me that kind of mapping experience, and it gave me a reason to go to a place and kind of investigate it, ostensibly through a game. But most of the kind of mapped locations in that game were also kind of interesting locations in my neighborhood. So it became kind of a cool way to go for a walk, play this game, but also see some parts and notice some areas of my neighborhood that I had never noticed before. So maps integrated into games is kind of an interesting new thing for us as well.
That is really interesting, I think, especially since it sort of runs counter to what a lot of the maps on the phone that you're using, Google Maps and whatever, do, which is take you very efficiently from one place to the other while paying attention just to your route and not to what's around you, and sort of, I think, disincentivizes exploration. So it's interesting that Pokemon is countering that and sending people to places on the map they might not have gone. But that's another thing that I think a lot of paper maps do, is encourage people to explore what's around them.
Betsy and Greg, thank you so much. It is a absolutely gorgeous book, which I am very pleased to have on my coffee table. And I look forward to potentially round 2 someday in the future to see more gorgeous maps, because quite frankly, I could look at maps all day.
Quite frankly, we do look at maps all day. It was really fun talking to you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
And if you want to learn more about Greg, Betsy, or their book, All Over the Map, we have links to get you started in the show notes for this episode, which you can find on our website, scienceforthepeople.ca. And we will attempt to link out to as many of the sample maps that we can, based on where we can find them on the internet. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week on Science for the People. Science for the People is produced by Rochelle Saunders and edited by Ryan Bromsgrove. Helen Quivalon is our publishing liaison. We get research help from Josh Witten and consulting support from Desiree Schell. Our frequently seen guest hosts are Marion Kilgour, Anika Hazra, and Jessica Yaros. Our theme song is called Binary Consequence, and it was written and recorded by Fractal Pattern. Science for the People is entirely listener-supported. You can find us on Patreon, where you can support us with monthly donations in any amount, or you can send us a one-time donation in any amount via the donate page of our website. Science for the People is created in partnership with the Skepchick Network, a collection of blogs, podcasts, and video content focusing on the intersection of science, popular culture, politics, and social justice. You can find out more about Skepchick at skepchick.org. The show is hosted by science news writer Bethany Brookshire and me, Rochelle Saunders.